They called me the daughter who abandoned the farm. The deed said otherwise. I want to start with that sentence because for 15 years I let my family's version of my own story stand mostly unchallenged. I left. I chose the city over the land. I chose a different life over the one my parents had built with their own hands. And in the eyes of my brother and sister, that choice made me something close to a stranger in a family that once, a long time ago, felt entirely like mine. I want to tell you what actually happened underneath that story, because the truth, when it finally surfaced, surprised everyone at that table, including me. My name is Laura. I am 41 years old, and I grew up on 420 acres of wheat and soybean fields in a part of the country where the horizon stretches so far in every direction that as a child I genuinely believed, for longer than I probably should have, that the earth simply ended somewhere just beyond our northern fence line. My parents, Ruth and Daniel Whitcomb, built that farm from almost nothing. My father's own father had lost most of the original family land during a string of bad harvests in the 1970s, and my parents spent the better part of 3 decades slowly buying back parcels of it, one hard-won purchase at a time, until the Whitcomb farm was, once again, something whole rather than something scattered and lost. I have 2 siblings. My brother Wade is 3 years older than me, and my sister Denise is 2 years younger. Growing up, the 3 of us were inseparable in the particular way that children raised in genuine isolation often are, riding the same dirt bike down the same gravel road, building the same forts in the same stand of cottonwoods along the creek, sharing the same exhausted, sunburned summers spent helping our father with harvest whenever the schools let out early enough to allow it. I remember one particular summer, the year I turned 11, when the 3 of us spent nearly every evening after chores building an elaborate, entirely useless fort out of scrap lumber my father had set aside for a shed he never got around to building. Wade, even then, was the one who understood how the pieces should actually fit together. Patient in a way that surprised adults, who only ever saw him racing dirt bikes or wrestling with Denise in the yard. Denise was the one who insisted on decorating it, hauling old curtains and a rug from the house that my mother pretended not to notice going missing. I was the one who drew the plans first, on the back of an old feed sack, insisting we follow them even when Wade's practical adjustments made more sense than my careful drawings. My mother used to say, watching the 3 of us from the porch some evenings, that she'd never seen children argue so constantly and love each other so completely at the exact same time. I think about that fort often now, given everything that happened later. It strikes me, looking back, that even then, the 3 of us each brought something different and necessary to whatever we built together. And that difference, rather than being a source of division, was simply how our particular family operated at its best. It would take 15 difficult years, and 1 recorded deed, for me to understand that this early truth about us had never actually stopped being true, even when it stopped feeling that way. I want to be honest about something before I go further into this story. I loved that farm. I want you to understand that clearly, because everything my family came to believe about me over the following 15 years was built on the assumption that I didn't, that I saw the land as something to escape, rather than something I carried with me my entire life, in ways they simply couldn't see. I left for college at 18, the first person in either side of my family to do so, studying architecture at a state university nearly 6 hours from home. I remember the specific conversation with my father, sitting on the porch the night before I left, him turning a piece of straw over in his fingers the way he did when he was working up to saying something difficult. He told me he was proud of me, and that he understood, better than anyone, what it meant to build something with your own 2 hands, whether that something was a barn, or a building, or a life entirely different from the one you were born into. My mother said less that night, but she hugged me longer than usual at the bus station the next morning. And I remember, even then, sensing something complicated in that hug. pride and grief tangled together in a way I wouldn't fully understand for another 2 decades. I remember the drive itself. 6 hours in a car my father had spent an entire weekend tuning up specifically for the trip, checking the oil twice, replacing a belt that didn't strictly need replacing yet. The particular way farmers express love through careful practical attention rather than words. Wade came with us partway, riding along for the first 2 hours before my father dropped him back at the farm to handle evening chores alone. And I remember him hugging me at that gas station stop, with an awkward, teenage stiffness, telling me to call home more than I probably ended up actually doing those first few semesters. Buried as I was in studio projects, and the particular disorienting loneliness of being somewhere entirely unfamiliar for the first time in my life. Those first 2 years away were harder than I ever admitted to my family at the time. I remember countless nights in a shared dorm room, homesick in a way that felt almost physical, missing the specific smell of the farm after rain, the sound of my father's truck coming up the gravel drive each evening, a sound so familiar I could distinguish it from every other vehicle that ever used that road. I never told Wade or Denise how hard those years actually were, partly out of pride, and partly, I think now, because some part of me already sensed that admitting difficulty would only reinforce a narrative I hadn't yet realized was forming. The idea that my life away from the farm was somehow easier, softer, less genuinely demanding than the life they continued to live at home. Wade stayed. He had always been the child most naturally suited to the rhythms of that land. The early mornings, the endless mechanical troubleshooting of aging equipment, the particular patience required to watch a crop grow slowly across an entire season, rather than seeing immediate results for immediate effort. He married a woman named Colleen 2 years after I left for college, and together they built a small house on the eastern edge of the property, close enough to my parents' house to help daily, far enough to have some version of their own life. Denise left too, eventually, though her departure was treated very differently than mine. She moved 45 minutes away to the nearest larger town, married a man who worked at the regional hospital, and visited the farm most weekends, close enough that her absence never quite registered, in the family's collective memory, as an actual departure. Mine, 6 hours away, visiting only on major holidays and for 2 weeks each summer once I started working, registered instead as something closer to abandonment, a word I heard, in one form or another, at nearly every family gathering for the following 15 years. I remember the first time I heard it used directly. I was 26, home for Christmas, sitting at my parents' kitchen table while Wade complained, not entirely joking, about a broken irrigation pump he'd spent the entire previous day repairing alone. He said, glancing at me, "Must be nice having weekends that don't involve fixing something at 4 in the morning." I laughed it off at the time, the way you laugh off a comment you're not entirely sure was meant as a joke. Denise, sitting beside him, added, "Yeah, must be nice being the one who got to leave." I remember my mother, standing at the stove with her back to us, going very still for just a moment before continuing to stir whatever she was cooking, saying nothing at all. That became the shape of nearly every visit home for the following decade and a half. A low, persistent undertone of resentment, rarely stated directly, mostly expressed through small comments about how nice my life must be, how easy, how disconnected from the daily grind that kept the farm actually running. I tried, for years, to explain that my life wasn't easy in the ways they imagined, that building a career as a woman in architecture came with its own exhausting grind, its own 60-hour weeks, its own particular kind of sacrifice that simply looked different from theirs, because it happened in a city office rather than a wheat field. I stopped trying to explain, eventually, somewhere around my early 30s, because I understood that the explanation was never really going to land. In their eyes, I had chosen convenience over commitment, and no amount of describing my actual life was going to change a narrative that had already calcified into something closer to family folklore than fact. I remember one particular Thanksgiving, when I was 32, bringing an award I'd recently received from a regional architecture association, foolishly hoping, in some small, private way, that it might finally register with my family as evidence of the actual discipline my life required. I mentioned it briefly at dinner, and Wade, without looking up from his plate, said, "Must be nice getting awards for drawing pictures while the rest of us are out here actually building things that matter." Denise laughed, not unkindly, but not defending me either, and I remember folding the conversation closed as quickly as I could, tucking the small, hurt part of myself away the way I'd learned to do at nearly every family gathering by then. I didn't bring up my work again at a family dinner for almost 8 years after that. My father died 8 years ago, a sudden stroke that took him within days before any of us fully understood how sick he actually was. I drove through the night to get there in time, arriving just hours before he passed, and I remember sitting beside his hospital bed, holding a hand that had spent 60 years working that land, feeling a grief so specific and so enormous that it seemed to physically press against my ribs from the inside. Wade and Denise arrived shortly after, and for those final hours, whatever tension existed between us dissolved, briefly, into a shared, uncomplicated grief that none of us had the energy to complicate with old resentments. I remember that hospital room clearly, the particular quality of fluorescent light that makes everyone look slightly ill, even when they're perfectly healthy. The sound of my father's labored breathing slowly, gradually evening out into something softer. Wade sat on the opposite side of the bed from me, and at some point during those final hours, without either of us saying anything about it, he reached across and took my hand, as well as our father's. The three of us connected in a single unbroken chain, for what would turn out to be one of the last, truly peaceful moments the three of us would share for years. I think about that unspoken gesture often now. Evidence, even amid everything that came after, that whatever fractures grew between us in the years following, some deeper connection had never fully disappeared, simply gone quiet, waiting for the right moment to resurface. It didn't last. Within a year of my father's death, the old undertone returned, sharper now, given new fuel by a specific, practical question that had never quite needed answering while he was alive. Who would eventually inherit the farm? My mother, in the years following my father's death, took on the full weight of managing the property's finances, a role my father had always handled alone, and one she'd never been fully trained for. Wade handled the physical operations, the planting and harvesting decisions, the equipment, the day-to-day labor that kept 420 acres actually producing income. But the money, the accounts, the increasingly complicated decisions about equipment loans and land taxes, and whether to lease out a portion of the northern fields to a neighboring operation, fell to my mother, a woman in her late 60s, who had spent her entire adult life managing a household, not a business. I offered, more than once during those years, to help remotely, to review documents, to bring my own professional understanding of contracts and long-term planning to bear on decisions that increasingly seemed too large for my mother to navigate entirely alone over the phone. Wade each time declined the offer on her behalf, telling me in a tone that had grown increasingly clipped over the years that the farm didn't need outside opinions from someone who'd chosen not to be part of its daily operations. I understood eventually that outside opinions was simply his way of describing anyone who wasn't him, including, apparently, our own mother's actual daughter. What none of us fully understood during those years was that my mother had grown increasingly worried about a specific pattern in Wade's decision-making that none of the rest of us had noticed from a distance. He had begun, quietly, exploring the possibility of selling a significant portion of the property's western acreage to a regional development company scouting land for a large agricultural processing facility, a deal that would have brought in a substantial lump sum but would have permanently altered the character and scale of the working farm my parents had spent 30 years rebuilding. My mother told me about this only once, during a phone call 3 years before her own death, her voice carrying a particular kind of exhaustion I hadn't heard from her before, even during the hardest years after my father died. She said Wade had brought her a proposal from the developers, presenting it as an obvious, sensible decision given rising equipment costs and increasingly thin profit margins on traditional crop farming. She said she'd told him she needed time to think about it and that he'd grown frustrated, telling her, more than once, that she was letting sentiment cloud a purely financial decision that needed to be made before the developer's offer expired. I remember standing in my kitchen in the city during that call, looking out over a skyline that couldn't have felt further removed from 420 acres of wheat fields, and feeling a specific, unfamiliar kind of protectiveness rise in me, hearing my mother describe being pressured, even gently, by her own son, over a decision this significant. I asked her whether Wade had a specific timeline in mind for when she needed to respond, and she told me the developers had given him 90 days, a window she felt was designed less around any genuine business necessity and more around simply not giving her enough time to fully think the decision through before the pressure to act became overwhelming. I asked her, during that same call, what she actually wanted to do. She was quiet for a long moment before she said, "I don't know yet, Laura, but I know I don't want to make that decision, because your brother pressured me into it before I had time to actually think it through." I didn't know, at the time, that this conversation marked the beginning of something my mother had already started planning, quietly, on her own, without telling any of us. My mother passed away 2 years ago, a slow decline related to heart failure that gave us, at least, the mercy of time to say what needed to be said, unlike the sudden shock of my father's death years earlier. I moved back to the area for the final 3 months of her life, taking an extended leave from my firm, staying in the small guest room of my parents' house, the same house where I'd grown up, sitting with her through the long, quiet afternoons that illness eventually settles into. I want to tell you about those 3 months because I think they matter enormously to understanding what came afterward. My mother and I talked, during those weeks, more openly than we had in years, freed, in a strange way, from the particular performance of family gatherings, the comments about weekends and convenience that had defined so much of our relationship since my father's death. She told me things I'd never fully understood before, about how hard those early years of building the farm back had actually been, about a miscarriage she'd had before I was born that she'd never mentioned to any of us, about the particular loneliness of managing a household's finances while everyone else assumed the physical labor of farming was the only labor that actually counted. I remember one particular afternoon, perhaps 6 weeks into my stay, when she asked me to help her sort through decades of old farm records stored in cardboard boxes in the attic, ostensibly to organize them for the estate attorney, though I understood even then that the task was as much about spending time together as it was about actual organization. We spent hours up there, dust thick in the afternoon light slanting through the small attic window, and she told me stories about specific years, the drought of the early 90s that nearly bankrupted them, the year Wade broke his arm falling from the hayloft, and she drove him 40 minutes to the nearest hospital through a snowstorm because my father couldn't leave a birthing cow unattended. The year I was born, and how relieved she'd been to finally have a daughter after 2 difficult years of trying following Wade's birth. I had never heard most of these stories before, buried as they'd always been beneath the more immediate practical concerns of daily farm life, and I found myself grateful, in a way I hadn't expected, for the strange gift that illness sometimes gives families. The unhurried time to finally tell each other everything that ordinary busy life never makes room for. She also told me, during one of those quiet afternoons, close to 2 months before she passed, that she had made a decision about the farm's future that she hadn't yet shared with Wade or Denise, and that she needed my help understanding exactly how to make that decision legally sound. I remember the conversation clearly. She was sitting up in bed, stronger that particular afternoon than she'd been in weeks, and she asked me, directly, whether I still resented the way the family had treated my choice to leave all those years ago. I told her, honestly, that I had made a kind of uneasy peace with it, understanding that resentment I couldn't change wasn't worth carrying indefinitely, but that yes, some part of it had never fully healed. She nodded, slowly, and said, "I've watched you build an entire career, an entire life, using exactly the same discipline and care your father and I used building this farm. You just built it somewhere else. I don't think that ever made you less connected to what this place actually means. I think it just made you less visible about it than Wade, and your brother has never been able to see past what's visible." She told me, that afternoon, that she had grown increasingly concerned about Wade's judgment regarding the farm's long-term future, not because he lacked dedication, but because his dedication had narrowed, over the years, into a kind of tunnel vision that saw the land primarily as a financial asset, to be optimized rather than a legacy to be carefully, patiently stewarded the way our parents had always understood it. She told me about the development offer, which had resurfaced twice more in the 2 years since she'd first mentioned it to me, each time with Wade growing more insistent, more frustrated by her continued hesitation. She said, "I don't think Wade would sell it all immediately if I left it to him and your sister jointly. But I think, within 5 years, maybe 10, the pressure of margins and equipment costs would eventually win that argument, the same way it's already started winning it in these last few years. And I don't think your father would have wanted this land broken up and sold off to a processing company, piece by piece, simply because it became the financially convenient decision in a hard year." I asked her what she wanted to do instead. She told me she wanted the farm, the full 420 acres, to pass to me, specifically, entirely, rather than being divided among the 3 of us the way a standard inheritance might typically work. She said she trusted me, more than either of my siblings, to make decisions about the land's future, based on what it actually meant, rather than what it could be immediately converted into. I want to be honest with you about my reaction to that conversation, because it wasn't simple gratitude. I was frightened, genuinely frightened, of what such a decision would do to my already strained relationships with Wade and Denise, both of whom had spent 15 years building an entire narrative about my supposed abandonment of the family's most important legacy. I told my mother this directly. I told her I wasn't sure I wanted to be handed something that would likely detonate what little remained of our sibling relationships. She listened to my concerns fully before responding. She said, "I understand why you're afraid of that. But Laura, I've spent 2 years watching you drive back and forth to help me with financial decisions Wade refused to even discuss with you. I've watched you handle contractor negotiations for the roof repair last spring with more patience and skill than your father or I ever had for that kind of thing. You have never once, in 15 years, stopped being someone who understood how to build and protect something carefully. I think the fear of Wade and Denise's reaction is a real fear, and I understand it completely. But I don't think it should be the reason I make a decision about this land's future that I believe, in my heart, is the wrong one." I remember sitting with her in silence for a long moment after she said that, watching the late afternoon light shift across the quilt on her bed, the same quilt she'd made by hand when I was still in elementary school, and feeling, for the first time in 15 years, something close to being fully seen by the family I'd always assumed had quietly written me off. I asked her whether she had considered simply dividing the land equally, the way the older will had specified, rather than placing this particular weight on me alone. She told me she'd considered it carefully, for months, but that every version of an equal division she'd worked through with Miss Alvarez eventually led to the same practical problem, an unavoidable pressure towards sale or subdivision once 3 separate owners with 3 separate financial needs and 3 separate visions for the land's future were forced to make joint decisions about its use. We spent the following several weeks, quietly, working with an estate attorney my mother had found on her own, a careful, discreet woman named Ms. Alvarez, who practiced in the county seat, 40 minutes from the farm, specifically chosen, my mother told me, because she had no prior relationship with anyone else in our family, and would have no reason to mention these meetings to Wade or Denise before my mother was ready to disclose them herself. I drove her to those appointments myself, 3 visits over the course of 5 weeks, my mother growing visibly weaker with each trip, but insisting every time on walking into the office under her own strength, rather than using the wheelchair I'd brought along just in case. Ms. Alvarez was patient with her, thorough in a way that put both of us at ease, asking careful questions to ensure my mother's decision reflected genuine, considered intent, rather than any temporary emotion related to her illness. A distinction I understood, watching the process unfold, was specifically designed to protect the deed's legal standing against exactly the kind of challenge Wade would eventually, predictably, attempt to raise. Ms. Alvarez drew up the necessary documents carefully, a formal deed transferring ownership of the property to me, to take effect specifically upon my mother's death, structured in a way that would be recorded with the county well before any family dispute could complicate its legal standing. My mother signed the documents in a private meeting at Ms. Alvarez's office 6 weeks before she passed, with 2 independent witnesses present who had no connection to our family whatsoever, and the deed was formally recorded at the county recorder's office 3 days later, a matter of public record from that point forward, though none of us, including me, mentioned it to Wade or Denise. I asked my mother, during one of our final conversations, whether she intended to tell my siblings about this decision before she passed, to give them time to process it while she was still there to explain her reasoning directly. She considered the question carefully, the way she considered most things during those final weeks, and told me she had decided against it. She said, "If I tell them now, I'll spend whatever time I have left refereeing an argument, instead of simply being your mother for the time I still have. I've made my decision. I've made it legally sound. And when the time comes, the paperwork will explain what I no longer have the strength left to explain myself." My mother passed away on a quiet October morning, 2 years ago, with all 3 of her children present at her bedside, a mercy I have never stopped being grateful for, however complicated the years leading up to that morning had been. Whatever tension existed between Wade, Denise, and me dissolved, briefly, in those final hours, the same way it had dissolved briefly around my father's hospital bed 8 years earlier. It didn't last, this time either, though it took slightly longer than before for the old patterns to resurface. The funeral was held at the small church our family had attended for 4 decades, and the reception afterward took place at the farmhouse itself. Dozens of neighbors and extended family filling the same kitchen and living room where I'd grown up, sharing stories about my mother's quiet, steady strength over 4 decades of farm life. I stood near the kitchen for most of that afternoon, accepting condolences, feeling more acutely than I expected the particular grief of understanding that the house itself, not just my mother, now belonged to a version of the past I could no longer fully return to. I remember one elderly neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who had known my mother since before any of us were born, pulling me aside near the pantry door and telling me quietly that my mother had spoken to her just weeks earlier about how proud she was of all 3 of her children, in ways specific enough to each of us that Mrs. Pruitt felt compelled to share it with me directly, sensing perhaps some of the old family tension, even from her position as an outside observer. She said my mother had told her, "Laura built something just as real as this farm. It just doesn't have dirt under its fingernails." I held on to that comment for weeks afterward, turning it over in my mind the way my father used to turn over a piece of straw, understanding, slowly, that my mother had likely been quietly defending my choices to others long before I ever knew she needed to. 3 weeks after the funeral, Wade called a family meeting to discuss the farm's future, holding it at my parents' kitchen table, the same table where, 15 years earlier, he'd first made his comment about my supposedly easy life away from the daily grind of farm work. He had brought with him an older will, one our parents had drafted together nearly 20 years earlier, long before my mother's health began declining, before the development company's offers had ever entered the picture, a will that divided the property equally among the 3 of us, structured in a way that would have required either a complicated co-ownership arrangement or, more likely, an eventual sale to divide the proceeds. Wade began the meeting by acknowledging, with what I recognized, even then, as a kind of practiced diplomacy, that this was a difficult conversation for all of us, and that he wanted to approach the farm's future fairly, given our long history together. He then explained, in careful, business-like terms, what he believed made the most practical sense. Given his years of hands-on experience managing the property, and given what he described as my own long-established distance from its daily operations, he proposed that he take over primary management of the farm going forward, buying out both my and Denise's shares over a period of years, using financing he had already begun quietly arranging. I noticed as he spoke that he had a small folder of his own sitting on the table, papers he'd clearly prepared in advance, financing estimates, and a rough timeline for the proposed buyout, evidence that this conversation had been planned with considerably more preparation than the casual, difficult for all of us framing he'd opened with suggested. Denise, seated beside him, nodded along throughout most of this explanation, and I understood, watching the two of them, that this proposal had been discussed and agreed upon between them well before I'd arrived at that table. I did not say anything for several minutes, listening carefully, the way I've learned, over the years, to listen fully before responding to something significant. When Wade finished, he asked, in a tone that suggested he expected only minor pushback, whether I had any concerns about the arrangement. I told him I did have a concern, though not the kind he was expecting. I told him that before we discussed any buyout arrangement based on the will he'd brought to the table, we needed to discuss a different document entirely, one that legally superseded it. I want to be honest about how carefully I had prepared for this exact moment, because I don't think the version of me who spoke next was born in that single afternoon. She was built over 3 months of quiet bedside conversations, 6 weeks of careful legal preparation with Ms. Alvarez, and 2 years of sitting with the specific, difficult knowledge that this conversation was inevitable, however much I might have wished, at various points, that it wasn't. I told Wade and Denise that our mother had transferred full ownership of the property to me, personally, through a legally recorded deed executed 6 weeks before her death, a document filed with the county, and a matter of public record ever since. I told them I hadn't brought it up earlier because our mother had specifically asked me to let the paperwork explain itself when the time was right, rather than spending her final weeks managing a family conflict she no longer had the strength to referee. Wade's reaction was immediate and sharp. He said this was impossible, that our mother would never have made a decision that significant without discussing it with either of them, that I must be mistaken about what the document actually said. Denise, quieter but no less shaken, asked whether I had some kind of proof, her voice carrying a note of genuine hurt that I recognized, and that softened, slightly, the resolve I'd been carrying into that conversation. The kitchen had gone very quiet. The kind of stillness that settles over a room right before something irreversible is said aloud. Outside the window behind Wade's chair, I could see the same eastern fields where we'd spent that childhood summer building our useless, beloved fort, the wheat just beginning to green with the early spring planting he'd overseen only weeks earlier. And I remember thinking, in that strange suspended moment, how strange it was that the land itself continued so calmly outside, while everything inside that kitchen was about to shift permanently. I did not raise my voice through any of what followed. I had learned, watching my mother's own quiet, methodical example during those final months, that the truth, properly documented, rarely needs to be shouted to be believed. I told them I had brought certified copies of the deed with me, along with a letter from Miss Alvarez confirming the circumstances of its execution, including the presence of 2 independent witnesses with no connection to our family, specifically chosen to avoid any question of undue influence or impropriety. I placed the documents on the table, the same table where 15 years of small cutting comments about my supposed abandonment of the family legacy had slowly accumulated into a narrative none of us had ever fully examined out loud. Wade grabbed the papers first, scanning them with the kind of frantic energy of a man looking for an error he was certain must exist somewhere in the details. His hands, I noticed, were not steady as he read. I said, quietly, once he'd had time to absorb what the documents actually confirmed. I understand this is a shock, Wade. I understand you've spent years assuming that staying physically present on this land made you its rightful primary heir, in a way that my choice to build a career elsewhere somehow disqualified me from. But Mom didn't see it that way, and she made a legal, deliberate decision to ensure her actual wishes, not the assumptions any of us had made about what those wishes probably were, would be the thing that determined this farm's future. Wade said, his voice tight with an anger I recognized from countless family gatherings over the years. You abandoned this place 15 years ago, Laura. You don't get to just walk back in now and claim it because Mom felt sorry for you at the end. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I understood why it might feel that way to him, but that the truth was considerably more complicated than the story he'd told himself and told everyone else for the past decade and a half. I told him about the development company's offer, the one he'd brought to our mother 3 separate times over the preceding years, each time growing more insistent as she continued to hesitate. I told him that our mother's decision wasn't born out of sentiment for a daughter who'd been away, but out of a specific, well-founded concern about what would eventually happen to this land. Under a decision-making process that had already begun prioritizing short-term financial pressure over the long-term stewardship our parents had spent 30 years building. Denise, who had remained mostly silent through this exchange, finally spoke, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. She asked whether this meant she and Wade would receive nothing at all. I told her honestly that this wasn't my intention, and that I had already begun working with Miss Alvarez on a plan to ensure both of them received a fair financial settlement, reflecting their contributions and their reasonable expectations, separate entirely from the land itself, which our mother had specifically wanted kept whole and undivided, under the stewardship of the child she trusted to protect its future, rather than optimize its immediate value. I told them I intended to keep Wade on as the farm's primary operational manager, a role he was genuinely skilled at, and had earned through years of hard, direct labor. But that major strategic decisions, particularly any future proposal involving the sale or development of any portion of the property, would now require my approval, based on our mother's explicit, legally documented wishes. Wade did not respond well to this proposal in the moment. Understandably frustrated by a shift in authority he hadn't anticipated, and clearly hadn't emotionally prepared for, he left the meeting abruptly, without finishing the conversation, and for several weeks afterward, communication between us was limited to brief, business-like messages about specific operational matters that couldn't be avoided entirely. I did not gloat during any of this, and I want to be honest that there were moments in the weeks that followed where I questioned whether I'd handled the confrontation as gently as I could have. But I also understood something my mother had tried to help me see during those final quiet weeks together. Vindication in a story like this was never really about proving Wade and Denise wrong in some satisfying, dramatic way. It was about honoring a decision our mother had made carefully, deliberately, out of genuine concern for something she'd spent 30 years helping to build, and ensuring that decision actually survived the family conflict she'd correctly predicted it would eventually face. Over the following year, slowly, the relationship between Wade and me began to find a new, more honest footing than the one we'd operated under for the previous 15 years. It helped, I think, that the development company's renewed offer, which resurfaced almost exactly 8 months after our mother's death, gave Wade an opportunity to see, directly, what our mother had actually been worried about. He brought the offer to me this time, rather than trying to push it through independently. And when I asked him to walk me through the full financial reasoning behind it, he did so honestly. And when I pointed out several long-term consequences to the farm's water rights and soil management that the short-term financial gain didn't adequately account for, He sat with that information for several days before eventually agreeing, on his own, that declining the offer was probably the right decision, not because I had overruled him, but because he genuinely reconsidered it once someone finally slowed the decision down enough to actually examine it fully. I remember the specific afternoon, several weeks after that development conversation, when Wade came to find me while I was reviewing some design plans at the kitchen table, the same table where our confrontation had unfolded months earlier, and told me, somewhat awkwardly, that he'd been thinking about the fort we'd built as kids, and how I'd always insisted on following my own plans even when his adjustments made more practical sense. He said, "I think I spent 15 years assuming that meant you didn't actually understand how things really worked out here. I'm starting to think it just meant you understood things differently than I did. Not worse, just differently." It wasn't quite an apology, not in so many words, but it was, I think, the most honest thing my brother had said to me in over a decade, and I recognized it gratefully, as the beginning of something neither of us had believed possible during that difficult meeting months earlier. Denise and I have rebuilt something closer to what we had as children, slowly, over quiet phone calls and the kind of small, ordinary visits that don't carry the weight of major family decisions. She told me, several months after that difficult meeting at the kitchen table, that she'd spent years assuming my absence from the farm meant an absence of care, and that watching how carefully I'd worked to ensure both she and Wade were treated fairly, even after legally having no obligation to do so, had changed something in how she understood the sister she'd spent 15 years quietly resenting. I moved back to the area permanently, 8 months ago, taking remote architectural consulting work that allows me to split my time between design projects and the farm's actual daily operations, learning, slowly, alongside Wade, the specific rhythms of a life I'd left at 18 but apparently never actually stopped carrying within me. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, more than a year removed from that difficult afternoon at my parents' kitchen table. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this cleanly on paper. I feel something quieter and considerably more bittersweet. I feel grief, still, for 15 years of family gatherings spent defending a version of myself that was never actually true. I feel gratitude, profound and ongoing, for a mother who understood, more clearly than any of the rest of us at the time, exactly what needed protecting and exactly how to protect it. And I feel something like cautious hope, watching Wade and me slowly build a working partnership neither of us fully believed was possible 15 years ago, back when 420 acres of wheat and soybean fields seemed like the only measure either of us had for what counted as genuine commitment to family. Some evenings now, when I walk the eastern fence line at dusk, the same walk I used to take with my father as a child, I find myself thinking about that old feed sack drawing of the fort, the one Wade always wanted to adjust, and I always insisted we follow exactly as drawn. I think about how long it took the three of us to understand that neither approach, his practical adjustments or my careful plans, was ever actually more valid than the other, simply different, necessary, and, in the end, only truly effective when combined. I think my mother understood that lesson long before any of her children did, and I think, in her own quiet, deliberate way, her final decision about the farm was her way of finally teaching it to us, however painfully, one last time. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Physical presence is not the only measure of devotion, and the people who insist most loudly that it is are often the ones who have never had to prove their commitment in any language other than the one most visible to them. I built an entire career, an entire disciplined life, 6 hours away from that farm, and it took my mother's careful, deliberate final decision to finally make visible what had always been true, that leaving a place does not mean you stop carrying its lessons, its discipline, its deep, abiding sense of what's worth protecting, wherever you eventually go. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since that afternoon at the kitchen table. Family narratives, once they calcify, are remarkably resistant to correction through explanation alone. I spent 15 years trying to explain my choices to Wade and Denise, and none of those explanations ever fully landed, because the story they'd built about my supposed abandonment had become more comfortable, in its own way, than the more complicated truth. It took undeniable, documented proof, not further explanation, to finally shift what years of conversation alone never could. Here is a third truth. Sometimes the people who love us most clearly are not the ones physically present for every daily struggle, but the ones who watch closely enough, over years, to understand who among us can actually be trusted with something precious when it matters most. My mother spent 2 years quietly observing all 3 of her children before making her decision, and she chose based not on proximity, but on the specific, careful pattern of character she'd watched each of us demonstrate over decades. Here's a fourth truth. Vindication does not require humiliation to feel complete. I did not use that afternoon at the kitchen table to punish Wade and Denise for 15 years of small, cutting comments about my chosen life. I used it, instead, to honor a decision our mother had made thoughtfully, and to begin, immediately, the slow work of ensuring that decision didn't simply become a new source of permanent family fracture, but instead a foundation for something more honest than what we'd operated under for the previous decade and a half. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Land, like love, is not actually diminished by distance. I spent 15 years being told that the miles between me and that farm meant I'd relinquished any real claim to what it represented. I understand now, watching my mother's careful final decision play out in the months since her death, that she never once believed that. She understood, long before the rest of us did, that the deepest form of stewardship isn't always the loudest, the most physically present, or the most visible. Sometimes it's simply the most trustworthy, quietly proven over years, and finally, when it matters most, put down clearly, undeniably on paper. That is my story. 15 years of being called the daughter who left, and one recorded deed that finally proved exactly how much I'd never actually stopped carrying with me. I think sometimes about that feed sack drawing, long since lost to time. The fort it described built and later dismantled decades ago. But I still have, somewhere in a box of my mother's things, an old photograph of the 3 of us standing in front of it, squinting into the sun, arms slung carelessly around each other's shoulders, the way children do before they learn all the complicated reasons adults eventually find to stand apart. I keep that photograph now on a shelf in the farmhouse office, where I do my design work. A small, quiet reminder that whatever distance grew between us over 15 difficult years, the foundation underneath it, the actual love, had never really gone anywhere. It had simply been waiting, patiently, the way good land always does, for someone willing to tend to it properly again. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that devotion doesn't always look the way other people expect it to, I would love to hear from you. Tell me in your own words about a time someone assumed your choices meant you cared less, when the truth was considerably more complicated than that. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story. Project Content Com Drama Stories created by Ua Video 5 Boschlik Toys Lines Text.